Lynn and I have just finished watching the fascinating award-winning documentary Wild Wild Country that's shown on Netflix. It's about what happened when Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh and his sannyasins went to America and founded Rajneeshpuram in Wasco Country, Oregon in 1981. And I think it made a very interesting example of the effect of egregores, which I talked about in an earlier video, which was watched by a lot of people. Now, the first thing that people tend to say is Rajneesh a cult? And I'm not a person who goes in for sort of strict definitions, as you'll know if you read my writing, but I do consider it to be a cult. And that isn't an insult, because for me a cult is not necessarily a very negative thing. For me, something like academic disciplines are cults. They fit many of the characteristics of that. And you could have a Star Wars cult and so on and so forth. So it's not a heavy thing for me to say that, yeah, I think Rajneesh was a cult. It's simply that it met some of the conditions which I associate with that. First of all, a cult to me is religious, but in the broad sense that I use, which means it's something which binds people together into a sort of whole. And as an academic discipline does. It tends to, traditionally, it was centered on a place or a person. So you could have a cult of Lourdes or a particular church, or you could have a cult of Dionysus. In this case, the cult was of Rajneesh. And so that fits the idea that it was a cult. It was built around him. Although he did say that, he said, I'm not to be worshipped, but regarded as a catalytic agent. Quote, a sun encouraging the flower to open. But still, it was centered around him, so it's a cult. More definitely, a cult I associate with exclusivity. There's a feeling you're either in the cult or you're an outsider. And very often they express that through a certain type of dress or clothing or a certain style. So in the case of academics, the style is their publications must be done in the academic style to be accepted. If they're not, if you write a popular book, very often they are outlawed or blacklisted. Now, in that sense, Rajneesh, certainly the sannyasins, felt they were different. And to some extent, because of what they'd learned, and that they felt they were superior. But it wasn't a heavy thing, I don't think. But they did express it in their clothing. Now, wearing red in India is not much of a statement because there's a strong spiritual condition of people who wear red. But when they moved to America, that was definitely a statement, and it really set them apart from the general public at the time. Now, the negative effect of that sense of difference can be contempt for outsiders. It's one thing to feel superior to other people, but another to treat them badly and contemptuously. And that was not really part of the Rajneesh thing, but it became so in that extreme case of what happened in America. And then there is blacklisting heretics. Now, I don't think that was innate in Rajneesh's cult, because I had quite a few friends who were very much into it in the 80s, but they left for one reason or another, and they weren't persecuted or treated badly as a result of that. But it did happen at the end of this episode in America when some of the people who'd been running it left the cult. They were very definitely blacklisted and slandered. So that element was there. So, yes, I'm going to call it a cult because I want to draw a comparison between cults and egregores, which Mark Stavish in his book true quite clearly. Now, it's also an egregore, Rajneesh and his followers. I pointed out in my original video on egregores that there are two sort of main theories about egregores. One is that an egregore is something which is built up by a group of people. And this is like the Tibetan idea of a tulpa, where several people get together and they sort of put their thinking and their mental energy into this thing. And I likened it to sort of getting a balloon and blowing it up. It gets bigger and bigger and is holding that energy of what people have put into it. And Rajneesh was definitely egregore in that sense, because what he proposed was something new. It was recognized in India when he first talked about it in 1970s as a new philosophy, a new idea. And it built up in this way, like egregore, and more people joined it. It grew more and more powerful, and it became an international thing. And it moved to America and so on and so forth. So definitely it was an egregore that was built up. But the other story of egregores is that they are something which exists independent of people. They're already out there. And I gave the example of if you started a new sort of tough cult, it could be that the war god is an egregore that's out there, and what you're doing is sort of connecting to it and linking to it, and that's how the egregore grows. Now this sannyasins, they fitted that as well, because every element of what he was proposing, Rajneesh was proposing, had existed before in some form or other. Free love, that had been around from time immemorial. In the 19th century, Randolph in America, in England in the 20th century, D.H. Lawrence, his group. Free love was an idea that's been around for a long time. It's not new. Nor was tantricism, using sex for spiritual advancement. Nor was things like aggressive therapies, they had been around. So you could say nearly all the elements already existed. Those egregores were out there. He just sort of brought them together into it, but he did form a new egregore from it. Now, this is an important point, because I'd like to say what happened when he moved to America in this story in the Wild, Wild Country. When they first arrived, why did they leave India? It was because they were being persecuted. Not in a big sense of, sort of tortured and that, but the government began to dislike them, and the public opinion turned against them, and they had tax demands and things like that. They were being threatened, and so they looked for somewhere, a new country where they could start afresh, and they chose America. And they arrived, and they found a place, this huge ranch, which they bought up. And there were very few people living nearby, so there wasn't a lot of opposition or anything. They were recognized as different, and for some people that was a bit threatening. But it wasn't much of a threat until the numbers started pouring in, more and more people. They had a plan for a city of 10,000 people to be built there. And this caused a lot of opposition and bad feeling. They began to despise these local people. And then what happened is there was some resistance to them. Someone actually bombed one of their buildings in the town, and they got paranoid about it. They started buying guns, arming themselves, and then, of course, they were seen as a very bad threat, and basically war broke out, and eventually they lost that war and had to leave America. Now, this might seem a very strange thing. Here's a cult which is centered very much around peace and love and the sort of 60s ideas of peace and love. It recognized that people had aggressive feelings and things like that, but a lot of the therapy was about releasing those, and so that you could live a life of harmony and peace and everything. And yet, there they were became embroiled in this terrible war, being hated by Americans. How could this happen? Now, this to me is an interesting example of egregores and how they can behave. Because what is the egregore of modern America? Well, I can tell you one very important part of it. In 1620, a group of people from Europe who had been suffering persecution decided to go and try to find fortune in a new land. And they landed in America in 1620, the Pilgrim Fathers, they were later called. Now, they were clearly different from the Native Americans who were there. But it wasn't really a problem, because the Native Americans taught them how to grow corn and things like that. And in fact, the very first Thanksgiving ceremony of all times was in autumn of 1622, 2 years later, when the Native Americans and the Pilgrim Fathers got together and shared a feast at harvest time. But more and more of them started to arrive. Now, I'm just going to read a short extract from the history. Over the next decades, relations between settlers and Native Americans deteriorated as the former group occupied more and more land. By the time William Bradford died in 1657, he had already expressed anxiety that New England could soon be torn apart by violence. In 1675, Bradford's predictions came true in the form of King Philip's War, a conflict that left some 5,000 inhabitants of New England dead. 3/4 of those were Native Americans. In terms of percentage of population killed, King Philip's War was more than twice as costly as the American Civil War, and 7 times more so than the American Revolution. So this was a very severe bit of history, and something that was built into the American egregore. Now, I would call it a sort of sleeping egregore. It's not that it had sort of vanished entirely. I'm sure there have always been some Americans who resented people coming in, but it was very much not a part of the new America that we know, because that was very much founded on welcoming people from other countries, particularly those who suffered persecution from governments in other countries. Everyone was given a chance, given a hope. It was the great American dream. And so for many people, it was like the new egregore, if you like, was one of everyone's welcome, everyone has an opportunity, everyone can make it. But that old egregore, like that thing I described, it's like it's floating out there, a sleeping egregore. And I reckon this is a very clear example of when the Sannyasins arrived in America. Think how similar it was. People persecuted in another country. They came to find freedom and everything. And they said, this place is heaven on earth, which is what the earliest settlers in America said. This is wild, wild country, they said, just as it was way back then. And it's as though they sort of, without realizing it, they latched onto this old egregore, and the past began to sort of play out with them. And they were puzzled, they said, several of the people interviewed, why are we carrying guns? I don't believe in them, and like that. The soldiers that came in following those initial sort of Pilgrim Fathers, the soldiers who came in to defend the colony, brought guns, and it was all out warfare. So I really just wanted to put that forward. It's really worth watching that documentary and to me, it's a very good example of how, a cult, an egregore, how it's strong and it holds people together. And actually, when there's opposition, it holds them together even more. They were really sort of locked together against the enemy. And yet, it's also possible for an old egregore to be out there and sort of, as it were, sleeping, but then you could contact it again. And you could say that this is, to some extent, what politicians like Trump can do. There's America, country which is very welcoming to settlers from outside, but they're beginning to feel a bit threatened by the numbers of them. And so he can call up this old egregore, we've got to get rid of them, we've got to get America great again, without realizing the whole thing initially built on just such an invasion from Europe.